Welcome back. Don Vento here with Caleb Company with another Facebook encounter with you. And I trust that what I'm telling you is biblical, but you check it out. Don't ever believe anything I say unless it's in Scripture. But what I want to talk to you about today is how I came to believe that we're living in the season of the Lord's return. Now, nobody knows the day or the hour. Jesus said that very clearly in Matthew 24, what's recorded in Matthew 24. But in that same passage, Jesus said that it would be like the times of Noah. Well, in the times of Noah, the people were peaceful, they thought. But Noah and his wife, his three sons, and their wives were all inside the ark, and the animals started coming to them. So though they had never seen rain, and they had never seen this kind of flood, they knew that they were in the season. They still didn't know when the rain was going to begin. So I believe we're supposed to know the season of the Lord's return, even though we don't know the day nor the hour. Now, this coincides also with the first few verses of Matthew 16, where Jesus is chiding the scribes and Pharisees because they could understand weather signs, but they couldn't understand the times in which they're living. And I'm even thinking of the Chronicles passage where the sons of Issachar understood the times and knew what to do. And then there's another passage in Luke 19 where Jesus says, you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. So we're to understand the times in which we're living. Now, Paul says in First Thessalonians, the 5th chapter, he says that the day of the Lord is going to be like a thief, the coming of a thief in the night, that people will be saying, safety and peace. People will. But then he says, and it'll be like a thief in the night, but he says he's not coming like a thief in the night for you, because you will be expecting him. He said it'll be like a pregnant woman. Well, a pregnant woman knows the season of the birth. She just doesn't know the day or the hour. And let me just tell you why I came to believe that we're living in the season of the Lord's return. Back during the Jesus movement, would have been in the 70s or 80s, I was teaching and sharing reading through the Gospel of Luke with a group of hungry new disciples, and they were spread out on the floor all over in front of me, 50, 60, 70 of them, and we had been reading through Luke's Gospel. But I came to Luke 21, and I really was edgy about even teaching it because I knew that this was the passage in which Jesus was answering questions, and it's a parallel passage to Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And in Matthew 24, the disciples were asking three questions. When will this be, which is the destruction of Jerusalem? When will the sign of your coming be? And when will be the sign of the end of the age? So that's the questions Jesus is answering, but he doesn't answer those questions just 1, 2, 3 like we wish he would, but he's answering them in Luke 21. And so I said to that group of young people in front of me, let's read through this Luke 21 one more time, just read it out loud together and see what the Lord will reveal to us. And I'm screaming on the inside because I do not know what I'm going to say. But that day, in front of those students, as I read through, there were 4 verses that have been solid inside of me ever since that make me think we're living in the season of the Lord's return. The first one was in Luke 21:20, where Jesus says that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you will know that her desolation is near. Now that one's easy, because all of us that know anything about biblical history and the history of the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, we know that it was destroyed in 70 AD. But the Romans began to surround the city before that, 66, 68. And so Jesus says, when you see this happening, you'll know that its destruction is near. So the believers that remembered Yeshua's words, Jesus' words, escaped the city. And they went to a place called Pella and other places. And the people that weren't believers thought they were in cahoots with the Romans because they knew what was happening, but they had just remembered the words of Jesus. So, all of a sudden I'm seeing, okay, that's the destruction of Jerusalem. And so I wrote in my Bible, which I do, pencil or light pen, 70 AD. We know that's what that happened. But then he says that in verse 24, he says, Jerusalem will be scattered to, that the Jewish people will be scattered to the nations, to all the nations. And they were. They were driven out of the city, and they're all over the world. And he said, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. And they were. I mean, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Turks, the Arabs, the British, they have been under Gentile control from the time they were under Roman control then, and they continue to be under the control of other nations until 1967. And suddenly I had been to Israel in 1967, shortly before the Six-Day War, and I suddenly saw that this is talking about when Jerusalem was taken over again by a sovereign Israeli government, and is today. So I wrote in my Bible, the times of the Gentiles fulfilled. Now, that's an interesting thing to think about, but let me explain it to you like this. The early believers were totally Jewish. You know that. On Pentecost, they were all Jews. Now, there may be some others, but the people who were responding were at least converts to Judaism. They would have been the ones there on Pentecost. The gospel wasn't open to Gentiles yet. That happened with Cornelius. So, totally Jewish believers. But then, when the gospel was opened to the Gentiles with Cornelius and going to all the other places, we had a time in those early centuries of Jews and Gentiles together. Jew-Gentile. But then the body of Gentile believers so turned their backs on Israel and the Jewish people that for about 18 centuries you had basically a Gentile community of believers, a Gentile church. There were no Jews in that church that remained practicing Judaism because they didn't practice Torah and all that, because both the church and the synagogue said, when you become a believer in Yeshua, in Jesus, you're not Jewish anymore, which was a lie. But for 18 centuries, you had a Gentile expression completely. But in 1967, when the Jesus movement started and the charismatic movement started, then tens of thousands of Jewish people came to faith, and now we no longer have just a Gentile body of believers. We have Jews and Gentiles living together. And so the times of the Gentiles exclusively is over. So then he says they will be scattered in the nation and trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is over. So I believe that's over. And he goes and describes all kinds of things that are going to be happening then. Nations will be in anguish and perplexity, apprehensive of what's coming on the world. Totally descriptive of our day. And at that season, at that time, he says, you'll see the Son of Man coming. So we're talking about the season of the Lord's return. And now Jesus had said in Matthew 24, which is the parallel passage, that there's coming a time of distress like never before and never to be equaled again. So we're headed into turbulent times. Can I say more about that in our day? We may be in turbulent times from now until the Lord returns. And so there's that kind of thing which we're seeing. But then he says in verse 28, he says, when you see these things taking place, that stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Let me say that again. When you see these things, the Jewish people scattered to the nations and coming back, when you see that beginning to take place, not in its fullness, but beginning, then stand up and lift up your head, because your redemption is drawing near. You see there, he's not saying the time is already here for the Lord to return, but there's a nearness of the Lord coming. And so we're living in this day. I believe we're living in the season of the Lord's return. And so it's a call for us to be alert, to to lean into whatever horrible things come, knowing that God is going to work good out of it. Remember, don't ever forget this, that Israel had the worst time in its history in Egypt shortly before their deliverance. They experienced the first two plagues. They didn't experience after that. And I go back to what Jesus said, quoting Daniel, that it will be a time of distress like never before. And then a few verses later says, and after the time of that distress, we see the sign of the Son of Man. So God will be with us, and I even believe that that when we go through the hardest time perhaps we've ever been in, then might be a time after that when we're here, but we don't experience the plagues, which is what the horror. We can walk right through because we've experienced it. So, if I'm right, check me out on this. We're living in the season of the return of the Lord. The return of Jewish people to their land, the return of Jewish people to Jerusalem, the coming of Jewish people to the Messiah, the coming together of Jew and Gentile in the Messiah together, are all signals that we're drawing near this one new man of which Paul spoke in Ephesians, the Jew and Gentile coming together. We're living in that time, so it's time for us to be alert, be strong, not be thrown by the kinds of things that are coming, and prepare and be ready to receive him. There are other things that have to happen, but let's live in this season to the glory of God.